Inviting me. I have to say I'm very sorry that I only arrived yesterday night because the program looked very interesting and I had feedback that indeed the week had been very interesting, so I look forward to the output this afternoon. And right now I'm going to talk to you about the ecosystem services in the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2020. That's more or less the outline of my talk. So the strategy was adopted in March this year, in June this year, sorry, and it was the result of a dual mandate. The first thing is that the EU heads of states and governments adopted an ambitious vision and targets for biodiversity in Europe in March. In March 2010, in between there was the Nagoya outcomes with the global targets again, and so that had to be translated into the EU Biodiversity Strategy. And I'll focus mostly on the EU target because it's more ambitious than the global one. So I think you heard it also from Patrick Chen-Break on the first day, but I'll just stop a bit on the headline targets, which is about halting the loss of biodiversity and the degradation of ecosystem services by 2020 and restoring them insofar as feasible. And then there's a global dimension. And it's worth comparing it to the 2010 headline target, which was about halting the loss of biodiversity. So there are two new elements. The first one is the focus on ecosystem services and not only biodiversity. And the second one is restoration. So we're not looking only to halt the loss, but also reverse it. And that's, sorry, this is a bit of a complicated graph. The only thing I want to show on this is the rationale behind the 6 main targets that are underpinning the strategy. So we focused on the drivers, the main drivers that lead to biodiversity loss, but also looked at the gaps in legislation. And this is basically to show that so if we look at the main sectors, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy was already existing, the Common Fisheries Policy, and the Nature Directive. So this is all about changing existing legislation to integrate biodiversity concerns. But there were two main gaps that we identified. The first one was invasive alien species, and the second one was that there was no specific policy focusing on ecosystem services. And so there's the second target in the strategy is devoted to that. So the first target is recognizing that biodiversity has an intrinsic value, and as I said, there's existing legislation in the EU to implement that. And of course, so that. Yes, sorry, is that better? So this is about stepping up the implementation of the nature directives with the recognition that, of course, Natura 2000 network will deliver ecosystem services, but this is really about the intrinsic value of biodiversity. The second target, on the other hand, focuses on ecosystem services, maintaining and enhancing them through restoration, and the restoring 15% of degraded ecosystem is a direct translation of the Nagoya Agreement, so there has been no analysis yet as to how this was going to be implemented, and the establishment of green infrastructure. And here the recognition is that although biodiversity has an intrinsic value, also biodiversity in the wider landscape and maybe ecosystems in less biodiversity rich areas also deliver ecosystem services that increase human welfare, and so there's a rationale for increasing these services through restoration and green infrastructure. And the Council conclusions that followed, the first set of Council conclusions that followed the adoption of the strategy recognize this. They welcome the focus of the strategy as a whole, on biodiversity as a whole, and on ecosystem services within and also beyond protected areas, in recognition of the essential services they have, and also of their intrinsic value. So that's the rationale for this target. And under this target, there's a number of actions. The first one is to improve knowledge about ecosystems and the services in the EU, and this is about encouraging member states with the support of the Commission to map and assess ecosystem services, to assess their economic values and integrate these values into accounting and reporting systems with a number of different deadlines. Other actions are about establishing priorities for restoration and promoting the use of green infrastructure, with the first step of adopting or agreeing with member states a framework for restoration, prioritizing restoration, and the second step, the adoption of a communication on green infrastructure next year. And then Action 7 is on ensuring no net loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, first of all by developing methodology for assessing the impacts of biodiversity of EU policies, and secondly by developing an initiative on no net loss by 2015. Sorry, and I also wanted to emphasize that some of these measures that I've just talked about were taken up again in the roadmap to a resource-efficient Europe. So this is important that they've been taken up in the flagship, one of the flagship policies, with the emphasis here being slightly different. So it's about investing in natural capital, and but the actions are the same. So it's announcing green infrastructure communication and a no net loss policy, amongst others, and also the mapping of ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are also in the background in the other targets, but I won't go through them. I wanted to focus a bit on financing issues, because the lack of financing was identified as one of the key factors leading to the failure of meeting the 2010 targets. So it's an important part of the strategy, and the strategy recognizes that there's a need to diversify and scale up resources through innovative financing measures, through encouraging investments from the private sector, and it mentions instruments like payment for ecosystem services, in particular in the context of green infrastructure, the use of public-private partnerships, use of market-based instruments, including biodiversity offsets and possibly habitat banking, to implement the no net loss initiative. And it's also a key issue throughout the discussions on the next multi-annual financial framework, where we're currently working towards mainstreaming biodiversity and the concept of ecosystem services in key EU instruments. And for example, it's a driving concept in the discussions on the reform of the common agricultural policy, but also cohesion policy, which was adopted yesterday, and where biodiversity and ecosystem services for the first time are explicitly mentioned. In the LIFE project as well, the LIFE fund, for example, which, I mean, all these, apart from the cohesion fund, are still under discussion. So this is, we'll have to see the final output. But for LIFE, it was traditionally focused on Natura 2000. The idea is to have another pot of money to fund biodiversity in the wider landscape in recognition of ecosystem services. And in the next budget, there's also a whole line for innovative financing instruments in LIFE, but also in other instruments, which we want to use also to encourage investment from the private sector in ecosystem services, and we're currently discussing with the EIB on how to do that in practice. And there's also a parallel discussion at global level, but I won't go into that. So the next steps now, the key policy documents, the biodiversity strategy and the roadmap to resource-efficient Europe are adopted, are of course the budget discussions, and there were first orientations published in June, and now it's about elaborating this concretely into the different instruments. And the next steps are really about improving the knowledge base on ecosystem services, and we had the first workshop on this in the EU, organized also by DG Environment, but also DG Research and Innovation, JRC, EEA, where we had very interesting discussions as to how we were going to implement the actions in the strategy. There was agreement that, to start with, we should focus on the biophysical mapping, and that economic values, there was a lot of interest in it, but it should probably come as a second step. And there will be a formal working group created with to involve external stakeholders in looking at how to do this. And at the moment there are a lot of questions, of course, but also interesting good practices with, for example, the UK National Ecosystem Assessments that can be useful to guide action in other countries. There was also an agreement that based on the member state initiatives, it would be useful to have an EU-level ecosystem assessment. In terms of policy mechanisms, I've outlined some of the key initiatives that are coming up. Ecosystem services will be a guiding, well, a key issue in these initiatives. For example, on the no net loss one, are we requiring to compensate for biodiversity per se? So do we want to recreate the ecosystems per se, or are we focusing on ecosystem services? And these are all issues that we will discuss with the stakeholders with clear options in the common implementation framework of the strategy, which will be operational early 2012, and there will be a dedicated one, for example, on no net loss. And I would like to end with, we were asked to give controversial statements or issues. So I wanted, can I do it now or do you want to do it later? I just wanted, well, in a lot of discussions with my colleagues, a lot of people are concerned about this concept of ecosystem services because they think it's going away from the intrinsic value. So my question would be, is the concept of ecosystem services the death of biodiversity? And of course I don't think so, and that's why ecosystem services are very prominent in the biodiversity strategy. I think you need both approaches, so you preserve biodiversity for their intrinsic value through fairly strict regulations, protected areas, but you also need the concept of ecosystem services to guide economic activities in the wider landscape so that you can actually evaluate trade-offs, because with with the concept of intrinsic value, you can't go very far with analyzing trade-offs. And also, I think you need to look at the multiplicity of ecosystem services and not single ones. But this, I think that I'll just throw this in for the discussion later on. Thank you very much.